and it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Claudia Masferrer to the Mexican Studies Seminar at the Katz Center at the University of Chicago. This is a wonderful community, and I feel like today we're going to have a really intellectually stimulating discussion with Professor Masferrer. She is an associate professor at the Center for Demographic, Urban, and Environmental Studies, and she's also the coordinator of the Migration, Inequality, and Public Policy Seminars at El Colegio de Mexico. She holds multiple degrees, as you might imagine. She's got a PhD in sociology from McGill University, a master's degree in statistics from the University of Texas at Austin, and also an undergraduate degree in applied mathematics from Instituto Tecnológico y Autónomo de México, also from Mexico City as well. And we're talking about how I came of age in Mexico City, but they changed the name of the place. When I was growing up, they called it DF, and now it's called CDMX. So I'm absolutely confused by that. But her scholarship is, she's not confused, and I'm glad that's why we invited her. Her scholarship is impressive, and she bridges sociology and demography, and she engages with theories of the family, migration, and race and ethnic studies. And she applies statistical methods to questions that are policy relevant, and she tackles big social problems, particularly focusing on international and internal migration, but also immigrant integration, as well as family dynamics and inequality. In her work, she has primarily focused on return migration to Mexico, as well as the consequences of these population flows for over a decade. And the work that she'll be presenting today is related to this key concern of her. It is called an Atlas for Understanding Return Migration from the United States to Mexico. And it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Masferrer.
Thank you, Rene, for such a nice and warm welcome. And thank you, Emilio, as well, for the invitation to the Katz Center. And there's some construction going on, so I hope it's not very disturbing. But it's really a pleasure for being here. And I think it's very, I'm really happy, and it's really interesting that I'm in the Center for Mexican Studies, because I believe understanding return migration, understanding migration will be key and has been key for many different social phenomena in Mexico. So I hope that at the end of the seminar, I make the case why is return so important for Mexico, but also for having a true binational US-Mexico conversation. So let me start by sharing my screen very quickly, and I hope you can see my presentation. So as Rene mentioned, I'm gonna be talking about an atlas that I recently published. I'm gonna be focusing on why it's important to understand return migration from the United States to Mexico. But I'm gonna start actually by talking and discussing a little bit of my work on my previous work on return migration. And I think that for understanding return, it's really important to understand the geography and the demography of migration. But when you talk about demography and geography, you also talk about the history of rural communities. And I think Emilio will be really interested, and I'm sure others in the audience, about what rurality means, what migration means in these different dynamics that are occurring in Mexico throughout the century. But it also means talking about the demography of those who left, the demography of the population that is currently living in the United States with or without a regular status. It also means understanding families that have a binational origin, that have a mixed status, both in Mexico and the United States. And the main question that guided my first work was going back home. Is it really going back home? What does it mean? Where is home? What does it mean to go back to Mexico if you lived in the United States for more than 17 years? This is the median amount of time of the duration of the undocumented population in the United States. So just trying to understand where is home is related to geography, and is related to sorry, this is really into demography. Now, the other big question is what happens when we talk about migration in relation to origin, to destination? What happens when we talk about return? Where is the destination or what is the origin of return? What is the community of origin? And all these ideas started to actually introduce the idea that you could be back to Mexico a different place. So the regreso a otro lugar is basically this idea. Okay, do I go back to the community that I left from? Do I go back to Mexico to another place? And what is the link between internal and international migration? Something that has also been studied in the literature of return. And then, I mean, the other main question that guided this kind of initial work was, what are the consequences, and what policies are needed, or what policies have been implemented, and to what extent we need actually policy to try to ease the challenges of these different populations. So I started looking at return when I was in the University of Texas at Austin. I was there from 2007, 2009. So these years, if you all remember, were really marked by the Great Recession, right? So back then, when I was studying return, and then later looking at the results of the 2010 census, we were discussing what were the impacts of the economic downturn, of the financial crisis, of the increase of unemployment. And we were not so much interested in understanding immigration enforcement, because back then we still didn't have Obama at the office, right? So the discussions were really different. But by the time this paper was published in 2012, we all already had some experiences of the increase of deportations with the President Obama. We were already thinking of return being multicausal, not only driven by the economic effects of the crisis and the recession. And so it's really interesting that this first paper published in 2012 really, when you think about it, I mean, the discussions 10 years later have shifted a lot. Now, what is very interesting for me, and I think will be interesting also for others at the center, is that when you think about the flow of from the United States to Mexico, this has traditionally been comprised by US-born and Mexican-born. So Mexicans that come back are called returnees. But those that are born in the United States and that arrive to Mexico without having lived in Mexico, we refer to them as immigrants. And so when you look at this flow moving south, you actually see that a large proportion of those that are born in the United States are minors. They're under age 18. And this talks about family dynamics, family migration. So you can see that most of the returnees are, I mean, as you might expect, are actually adults, right? What you can also see very clearly is this increase in the flows of return, and then the number of Mexicans and US-born that arrived within the period of 2005, 2010. This is, again, as I said, this like period of increased return and immigration. These volumes were the ones that explained that Mexican net migration rate actually declined and became negative. And I think it's interesting to think beyond the idea, the prototypical idea of a male Mexican migrant living in the United States. When you think about return, this is not so much the case. And this idea of understanding what happens with the minors, what happens with the US-born population, led us to publish this piece in demography a couple of years ago with some colleagues at University of California, Davis and University of Alberta, trying to understand what was the situation with these 500,000 US-born minors. And 500,000 is very close to the DACA population right now, I mean, Mexican population under DACA. But we can discuss later if you want to what extent is this population under the same attention, even if the volume is considerably similar. These US-born minors are throughout the territory, making it very hard to actually, sometimes in some communities, even realize that they are there. They're concentrated in some regions in the border, but they're actually everywhere. And we're not talking about a negligible size population. The total immigrant population, the total foreign-born population in Mexico is today in 2020 is 1.2 million, right? And when you consider the US-born population, this is 750,000. Of those, 500,000 are underage, but you see a large concentration between 18 and 20 years of age. So underage in Mexico is 18, right? So most of these minors in 2015 were not necessarily recent arrivals. They have settled, and we can trace this settlement back to the increase of arrivals till 2010. As I said, they're throughout Mexico. I'm not going to go through a lot of detail, but what's really interesting is that most of them are living with Mexican parents, at least one. And you also see some minors with absent parents. You see around 11% of those recent, for example, 2015, that are living with Mexico-US parents. But in general, we see that this immigration is linked to the return migration of their parents. And in many cases, so around half of them have dual citizenship. All of them are potentially dual citizens, US-Mexico citizens, even if they did not apply at this time to US citizen. In a different project, I'm actually looking at who is getting Mexican citizenship and registering for Mexican citizenship. But I mean, in theory, everyone having a Mexican parent is eligible for dual citizenship. Now, when we think about how these minors will fare and how these in the labor market and how their well-being will be defined in terms of the well-being of their parents, it will be very important to understand how returnees incorporate into the labor market. And this has been also another area of research. And in a nutshell, returnees had a relative advantage in the early 2000s. This advantage declined over time. And we see that actually both returnees and US-born are earning as bad as the Mexican non-migrant population, unfortunately. But what was interesting in this work with Nicole Denier was trying to understand the regional variation, right? We know that there are different labor markets in Mexico. We know about regional disparities. And so we wanted to see to what extent this occurred in different regions in Mexico. The northern region still appears to be a little bit better, both for the returnee population and the US-born population. But in general, the main idea was trying to find heterogeneities in the Mexican territory, and it was something that was already interesting from before, from my original from my first work, was trying to understand geography and demography, right? So traditionally, migration studies have focused on what we call migration regions, and we make the case both in our paper looking at regional variation that this is not enough in understanding what happened. So yes, the northern region of Mexico is different to the southeast, to the central area. And we might think that it was also different to this traditional sending area where lots of studies in central Mexico have originated, talking Guanajuato, Michoacán, Jalisco, Nayarit, Durango, San Luis Potosí, where we know that traditional migration has been occurring for many, many decades. But one of the main ideas of trying to have this atlas of return migration was trying to see, going beyond this definition of the 4 regions, trying to understand what happens at the state level. And this is not enough, I mean, right? I mean, we could go and we could discuss why it's important to understand at the municipality level and at the community level, but at least this was a first attempt to trying to understand what happens within these states. And let me just start by saying that it was really important for me when kind of like working at this atlas to read everything that has been published in the recent years, to try to understand what do we know for each state. And I think, and I don't pay tribute here to all of the work, and I'm focusing about my work, but when you look at and do an extensive literature review, you find lots of dissertations, master's thesis, undergraduate thesis, and a lot of case studies that sometimes go unnoticed. And when we think, okay, what's happening in Guerrero, when we think what's happening in Oaxaca, we do need to go and try to do this extensive literature search. And so one of the main focuses of this atlas was first to review what was the situation of each state, trying to focus on 2000, 2015. At that time, this was before 2020, so we didn't have the census, but we was trying to summarize the basic sociodemographic indicators, do a little review, and define the pending issues. And as you can see, that there was an increase of attention and publication related to return. This has actually increased a little bit if you update in recent years. But even if circularity was a main characteristic of Mexico-US migration, the notion of return goes a little bit beyond this idea of seasonal work. And that's something that has also been widely studied. So the basic idea that I wanna focus on the atlas is, okay, who are they, right? Are there differences between the states or the regional differences? Who are these returnees? It's well known that around 30% of the returnees are females, but is this the case everywhere, for example? What happens when are they economically active populations? We see that overall there's a concentration between 25 years of age and 45 years of age, but is this really the case everywhere, right? Where are they concentrated? Yes, they're concentrated in this traditional sending area of Western Mexico, of Central Western Mexico, but as I said, just as US-born immigrants are everywhere, we actually have returnees all over the country and in every municipality. And then also trying to understand, well, a little bit better, where are these US-born minors, who are they, and just trying to map basic level characteristics. So this is kind of like the idea of the aims of the atlas. I wanted to summarize the pending issues for each state, and I started presenting the pending issues at the national level, which was really hard because of, I mean, as I showed, there has been many interesting publications and lots of advances in the scholarship. But I summarized these pending issues in three main areas. So first, it's still unclear what are the implications of return, and specifically linked to the local conditions of the contexts of reception of these migrants. And by local conditions, I mean very explicitly, what is the effect, for example, of criminal violence that has increased over recently, of insecurity, to what extent integration processes and return itself is linked to changes in industry manufacturing within Mexico. And then also within this idea of local context, we can think of even how the return is more broadly linked to other social change, to broader social change in Mexico, right? Economic, social, political. This is still unclear from the different publications. Something else is trying to understand how return is actually linked to family trajectories, to work trajectories, to migration trajectories. To what extent is there gonna be a remigration, for example, of those children? And I think it's still unclear how, I mean, there's some text looking at policy implications of return. It's still unclear how to define this policy, how to define these programs. And a lot of research has recently looked at discrimination and stigma of being deported or criminalization, but it's still unclear how can this narrative associated to migration can change and the real impact of cost of return on the different outcomes. So for every state and at the national level, I list the references. This is just a very quick snapshot of the references, but I was really interested in having a very succinct description of each of the states. So for each state, I present kind of like the summary of what is happening. Then I show the indicators, and I'm not going to show all of them. I'm going to show a series of indicators focusing on the socio-demographic characteristics. And I just want to show you a very quick example of why kind of like geography matters. So Oaxaca actually falls in this basic description of having most of the returnees concentrated in these working ages, but you actually see more men than in other states. You actually see higher concentration of 30, 34 years old. And when you talk about Sonora having a different age and sex distribution and having older population that are returnees, you need to think, and this is where I think it's important to think on the demography of these populations. What are the needs of coming back after 50 years of age? Not necessarily upon retirement, right? But entering the labor market when you're 50. And I think just the type of questions that raise, looking at this very basic demographic description of the population, will imply interesting questions. Something else that is important to notice, for example, is that there are differences between these populations. So I said that the general advantage that returnees had diminished over time, and actually there was a convergence down. And so in some places, the gap between the earnings of Mexicans, non-migrants and returnees exists. But for others, we actually saw that, I mean, returnees, for example, in Guanajuato, both men and women earn less since 2010 than non-migrants. But this is not necessarily true for other places, right? So for example, in Michoacan, you see a similar story, but for women, there seems still to be a relative advantage that disappeared later in 2015. For Estado de Mexico, this big relative advantage, the kind of like the fall on the reduction of this gap actually occurred more dramatically than in other places. And so again, I mean, understanding to what extent the local conditions or the characteristics of the returnees or where they're settling in Estado de Mexico led to these significant changes is kind of an unknown even from the extensive literature search. So as I said, there are very different pending issues still for to understand. I think it's interesting in general for this is just a case of 3 states. I don't want to show all of them, but in general, there's still a big question regarding incorporation of returnees and how returnees enter the labor market. The traditional accounts of how, even if I don't know how many of you are aware of Jean Papayo's work, for example, in the early 2000s, but was looking on entrepreneurship and was thinking about how returnees were going to be employers. And you need to think also how this was linked to the basic ideas of development. And when you think about the nexus between development and return migration, it was always perceived that return migration was going to bring these new ideas associated with modernization. And so being an employer was opening a business was actually going to be the kind of like the expected way. And we don't see this. We see that at the national level, 70% of the returnees are entering the labor market as employees, salaried employees. But actually you see that even in Guanajuato, where many studies have focused on the role of industry for working at own account, it's actually not the case when you look at how they're incorporating. And it's interesting that it's still unclear what the role of tourism is. For example, you see some studies focusing at San Miguel de Allende. In other states, for example, in Nayarit, you see very interesting studies looking at the role of Rivera Nayarit. In Quintana Roo, you see what's happening in Isla Mujeres and tourism. But it's still unclear to what extent all these changes in the different industrial sectors in Mexico reflect and kind of like translate into the lives of Mexican returnees. And they're very interesting cases that, for example, thinking on the car industry, there are some very, very important publications in looking at Puebla, what was the case of Puebla, but not necessarily what's happening in other areas like Guanajuato or even Querétaro, where you actually have, I don't know, aerospace industry. So I think in general, the role of contextual local factors is still missing. In Estado de Mexico, it's interesting because it's still unclear how this is linked to other demographic changes in the period. And then it's very interesting to what extent, it's still unclear to what extent what is observed in the metropolitan area of Mexico City. So René was asking about Ciudad de Mexico, it gets confusing, right? So you have Ciudad de Mexico, Estado de Mexico, Mexico, the country, you have La Zona Metropolitana del Valle de Mexico, which is the metropolitan area, which involves Ciudad de Mexico and Estado de Mexico. But I think in general, what is still missing is to what extent metropolitan dynamics can be located in other contexts. And by metropolitan dynamics, I don't refer only to economic or industrial dynamics. You can think of how, even in Chicago, for example, how invisible migrants are, how visible migrants are vis-a-vis a smaller community, right? Or how social networks in Mexico City differ to the social networks and the role of social networks in rural communities that have been traditionally studied, right? So I think still this idea of place and the place, how place matters is still unclear in the literature. And in the case of Michoacán, it's very, very clear, but it's also very clear in other states and at the national level even, that there are some studies that have started thinking of the role of violence and insecurity in return and immigration. And we know there are recent studies looking at internal displacement, for example, and forced internal displacement due to criminal violence and drug trafficking. But it's still unclear how these effects are going to be associated to changes in kind of like the social makeup or fabric of these communities and at the individual level as well. And not only, right, at what happens in the local economies or what happens in investment and development more in general. So I think it's still unclear kind of like the role of violence at these different micro, meso, or even macro level. I prepared, I'm gonna leave at the chat the link to a small animation when we presented the Atlas in Spanish. And the idea of this video was that I wanted this Atlas to be a compass for returning to Mexico. And I like the idea of a compass because it usually points north, but it could potentially point to different places. And I think, so I just to finish the idea of the Atlas, if you're in the United States and you're from Mexico, you might think home is in Mexico. For others who are in Mexico, if they left their family behind, their home might still be in the United States. But to what extent this knowledge of return and the information and the role of place and the role of who is returning will help defining different programs or different understandings of return itself, I think it will be important. So I'm gonna leave at the end the YouTube link. And I think in general, just to finish, what has been really interesting in talking about returns so far, and this was on purpose, is that I have not talked about deportation itself, right? And I think something I want to make clear is that return happens for many different reasons. And a lot of focus in policy discussions have to do with the role of deportation. And yes, many come back for after being deported or fearing deportation, to actually kind of before having a deportation order. But if you think that family return occurs, then you could also think that for every deportee, you might have 3 other returnees, right? The impact of immigration enforcement more broadly will not limit to the person that is deported, but of course will have a strong impact both on the decision for returning as returning itself if you were under a deportation order, right? So President Obama deported around 3 million Mexicans. It's unclear to what extent all of this population is now in Mexico or not. On a different project, whether in Hamilton, I'm studying de facto deportation, so what's happening to the children. Many of these US-born children, but it's unknown right now how many are actually, you could think that they're actually de facto deported, right? If one of their parents was deported. But something that is very clear is that deportation and unplanned return affects the population in both countries, right? Both Mexico and the United States. First of all, by dividing families, if the person that is deported cannot go back where their family stayed. And I think in general, what I really like about thinking on return is that I can think of, first of all, by nationality, what happens when you are as a family member of these mixed status families. It also conduces us to think about immigration in Mexico more broadly. And this is an area that is relatively new. Our immigrant population is relatively small, right? Less than 1% of the total population in Mexico. But I do think that understanding return and immigration and the arrival of these children is a first step to actually think beyond reintegration or immigration. And hopefully, many of the ideas that I've been discussing in terms of, not in the Atlas, but more broadly in my research in terms of how to actually think of the well-being of the migrant population in Mexico, regardless of birthplace or regardless of citizenship, right? So you could have dual citizens. I think this will be necessary for the Mexican migration phenomenon. And this idea of having a binational team and a binational focus and perspective, it's something that that I've been working on. So again, if you also want to try to understand the changes of migration in the last decade, there's this edited volume that I worked with Agustin Escobar, where we have actually a binational focus. Then you also have this other work on the effects of COVID, where Susan Gesh from University of Chicago participated. And there's also an effort of having a binational team thinking on US and Mexico migration. And I think this will only benefit Mexican studies in general, but also the studies of these populations in the United States. So thank you so much. And I'm really hoping there are reactions and questions, and there's my email. And there's also the address of the Seminar on Migration, Inequality, and Public Policy that I coordinate if you're curious about all the different activities. I'm also happy to talk about a little bit about that. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Claudia, for this wonderful presentation. Lots of data here. And now we open the floor for anyone that may have a question or a comment for Professor Masferrer. And you can raise your hand, and we have a question here. Please go ahead.
Oh, thank you, Renee. I just wanted to preface my couple of questions by saying that I'm a huge fan of your work, Professor Masferrer. You might remember we were in email communication a couple of years ago. I was trying to get you to apply for the fellowship at the University of Houston. But in any event, to get to the question, I was going to a clarification and just a question. When you mentioned the 1 million immigrants, you said that over half were basically ethnic Mexicans. And I have not read the article. And my question was, Mexico, especially the tourist industry, always likes to talk about the 1 million US immigrants that are in Mexico. So my question is it okay for us to say that basically those million are majority ethnic Mexican? I mean, because of the graph that you showed. And my second question, if you don't mind, is you made it really clear in your data set that 2005 and 2010 was really intense under Obama for deportations. And I'm seeing people on Twitter, I know I shouldn't go on Twitter, but I'm seeing people on Twitter saying that something similar is happening with Biden. And I'm just curious, you don't have to answer the question, but you're such an expert on this stuff that somebody was suggesting that Biden was basically a deporter-in-chief 2.0. And I was just wondering what your opinion about that was. And just if you have a chance, I was curious about your data set. What do you think are the best data sets to use to extrapolate all this incredible information that you have? Thank you, Professor, and good seeing you.
Should I answer, or do we take a couple of questions? Renee,
yes, please go ahead. And while you address that question, then we also ask anybody else who you know, to raise your hand, and we'll get to you next.
Okay, great. Yeah, I see Philippe. So thank you, thank you for those comments. It's nice to hear that you say that you're a fan of my work. No, okay. So just two clarifications. So the total foreign-born population in Mexico in 2020 is 1.2 million. Of those, 750,000 are US-born, and 500,000 are underage and US-born, right? So it's not correct to say that there's 1 million Mexican Americans in Mexico, right? It's really 500,000 Mexican Americans, let's say. I mean, not all of them are currently living in Mexico with a Mexican parent, but most of them are. Now, I mean, I talked about this number with a former ambassador of the United States in Mexico. The US Embassy has an estimation that is slightly larger of the US-born population. It's true that there's some people living in Mexico from the United States that have dual residence because they basically have, I mean, they own a house in Mexico, but they live most of the time and go back in the United States, go back and forth. And for that population, it's unclear, but that's mostly comprised of adults. But what I do want to stress is that the majority of the US-born population living in Mexico are not retired, is not a retired population that came here to, I mean, kind of like, and after being 65 or older. This is mainly comprised of children. It's still unclear to what extent, or how big it is. Right. Recently, there has been an increase, for example, of studies on digital nomads, especially with the pandemic, but a little bit earlier, we were trying to understand to what extent there was a US-born population living in Mexico, but working even in the United States. And you can think why it might be more interesting not to pay a rent in Chicago if you can do work elsewhere. But those data is still unclear, right? I mean, we don't know how many they are. And the U.S. Census, it's unclear to define who they are. But if you think that they were captured in the Mexican census in 2020, and they are not children, they are within these 250,000 US-born that are not under age 18, right? Now, the period of 2005-2010 was this period where we, in the census of 2010, captured an increase of return. So we were using, I used the decennial census, the intercensus survey, and the population count. So we have 5-year period data where basically each individual is asked where they were living 5 years ago. So they were living in Mexico, let's say in 2010. They lived in the United States in 2005. So you know that they arrived within the 5-year period. And this is very standard for censuses and household surveys as a measure of migration, right? And immigration or return. But this is kind of standard. We don't have data. In 2020, the Mexican census introduced a question on costs of migration. So since 2020, we know who was deported, who returned for family reasons or economic reasons. And deportees, according to the 2020 census, comprise around 10% of this returnee population. But when you look at the data from DHS, from Homeland Security, then there's a mismatch, right? There are more events of deportation than Mexicans that define their cause as deportation. Now, there's also one important thing to clarify. These are two, border apprehensions and deportations or removals are very different things. So border apprehensions and people deported at the border, especially during the pandemic, under Title 42, considering the situation of the pandemic, meant that people were deported back to Mexico, but this is not the same as a removal from the interior after having lived in the United States for many years, right? So President Biden, when you look at the numbers of border apprehensions, these increased because basically people were at the border, were apprehended, detained, and sent back very quickly. And then the next day you could again try to cross the border, and then you count 2, 3, 4, 5 times, right? So all of the statistics on border apprehensions during the pandemic under Title 42 are really inflated. So it's unknown to what extent or how many people actually attempted to cross the United States from Mexico. And this applies for Central Americans, for people from Haiti, from everywhere, right? So it's just, the statistics are really inflated. So just in terms of the ideal data, I think it would be great to not only have residents 5 years ago, but actually have the trajectory, the migration trajectory. Then you could hopefully ideally trace even where they were living in the United States and the different moves that people made before arriving to Mexico or after arriving to Mexico. But unfortunately, we do not have this. We do not have we don't have. But yeah, I'm curious about the other questions, so I'll stop there.
Thank you. We have also a question by Philippe Becker.
Yes, thank you, Professor, for this fascinating presentation. My question had to do with kind of an interest in transnational organizations or just associations between Mexico and the US, and kind of to what extent does membership in those transnational organizations influence just, I guess, the integration of returnees to Mexico, if kind of that's facilitated by belonging to these associations. And also kind of in the data of return migration or deportation, like what percentage of perhaps returnees or deportees are people who come from major cities? Because I guess I'm interested in the question as well, if there is big divergence between kind of people coming from so-called sanctuary cities, say like Chicago or other areas in the United States. Thank you.
Yeah, so within this ideal data, it would be great to know where they came from. And we don't know. So, ENADID, the National Survey of Demographic Dynamics, does ask broadly state of residence, but mainly they capture, California, Texas, I think Chicago is in the list, and then elsewhere, right? So it's really hard to actually try to trace where they were coming from. And this data is also not capturing, it's not capturing the places where they lived, but it's also not capturing, whether or not they're coming from sanctuary cities, where they lived before. This survey asks kind of like visa or permit of like status at entry, right? So this underestimates the population with the regular status, because you might enter with a visa and then overstay or lose the status. So yeah, we don't have data on this. In terms of the transnational links, this is very, very interesting, and I think Chicago is a very interesting case because there's actually a strong tradition of association between migrant organizations, both in Mexico City and Chicago. So I'm thinking of, for example, ODA, Other Dreamers in Acción, and the links with the people from the University of Chicago, at Illinois, and I think, the other way around, well, Illinois at Chicago. One of the interesting things, so I'm answering your question in a disordered way, but one of the things that is interesting is that these ideas of the links between migrants and migrant organizations, I think you frame it as a transnational, as a question on transnationalism. And it's interesting, there's a recent paper published by Waldinger looking at the changes of the meaning of transnationalism for this population, for example, right? I think what's interesting, and again, thinking on place, if you think about the role of migrant organizations in general, in a place like Tijuana, for example, this will be very different to the role of organizations in a place like Mexico City. Mexico City has a good number of associations and migrant organizations, not necessarily all of them working harmoniously together, but because they're having different objectives and different populations, target populations. But I think that because place matters and because just the organization of the city is very different, I think organizations in a place like Tijuana have been relatively successful in providing immediate support, especially for deportees, right? Because border cities will, by definition, include larger shares of population that have been deported and that need very basic, immediate needs and challenges to overcome, right? Whereas when you think about places in Mexico City or even Puebla or other like areas where migrants arrive, then these challenges and the needs or the objectives of these organizations will be different. And so it would be really interesting to understand kind of like these roles of organizations. And migrant organizations have traditionally been focused on development and the role of, I don't know, even if you think about Tres por Uno, for example, and the role of infrastructure, right? But the needs of returnees will be different. And so it would be interesting to see really how this reflects both in the objectives and in practice. Yeah, and just if you're interested in Mexico City and sanctuary cities, it was really interesting that Mexico City decided to have a program of reintegration and promoted itself as a sanctuary city, right? And for me, it was like, come on. I mean, like they're all Mexicans returning. Like they're not undocumented migrants needing protection. But it was really interesting how the rhetoric of being a sanctuary city actually permeated the definition of the programs of Mexico City for returnees when it didn't make a lot of sense in some ways, but yeah.
Thank you, Claudia. And there's a question also by Emilio Curi.
Yes, hi, thank you, Claudia. That was really, really fascinating. And, you know, it raises a lot of questions. I mean, I'm not a sociologist, but, you know, I mean, just broader questions about what this all means. So I have a kind of a tangential question that is related more to that. So it's maybe just speculation, but, you know, and some people may not know that last year, the Mexican Constitution was changed to remove any limits on the transmission of nationality for those who are Mexican nationals, but were themselves not born in Mexico. So, I mean, it's a complicated story, but essentially it can now be, you know, endlessly transmitted by you know, from people who were not themselves born in Mexico, but claim Mexican nationality to their children who are not born in Mexico, but can become Mexican, and then their children, you know, opening up, I mean, in a multiplying way, you know, the potential for the growth of the Mexican national population living abroad. So I just wanted to know how you think, I mean, if this really does get embraced in the way that it could, you know, because before that, there were limits on claiming Mexican nationality that were very strict if your parents were not born in Mexico themselves. I mean, this is going to really begin to blur, I think, you know, over time, sort of a line. I mean, it's likely then that the Mexican national population in the United States will become even larger, right? And so, you know, you could end up with the case of a very sort of, I think, internationally unprecedented situation of a very large percentage of a national population living abroad, but not just abroad, but in the country next door, which is actually very important here. And so how might this change? I guess my question, you can take it in any direction you want, sort of the kinds of things that you study, when all of a sudden you could have people who are, I mean, third generation Mexican nationals who were born in the United States and whose parents were also born in the United States, but who have chosen to continue to identify as Mexicans in terms of migration, in terms of return migration, but in terms of just more broadly, if you want, sort of, you know, what it means to be Mexican.
Thank you, Emilio, for that. I think it's definitely an interesting question. And so I'm working with Victor Manuel Garcia Guerrero, a colleague from CEDUA, trying to understand kind of like who registers in Mexico to obtain Mexican citizenship and nationality. And when you see the age pattern of those who are actually opting for a birth registry, a birth certificate, you see that it's usually linked to the need of Mexican citizenship, right? You might even just ask yourself, you were asking this interesting question of what it means to be Mexican, but you could also ask, why, what for, right? Why? I mean, I think there will be, as you say, kind of like this idea of going back to the parental homeland, or even to this origin, ancestral origin among some second or third generation. But in general, if you're living in Mexico and you are born in the United States and you have the option and you see all these different challenges for very different bureaucratic processes, you might say, okay, I'm gonna opt for Mexican citizenship. But I do think that when you look at the work, for example, on citizenship by Pablo Mateos or Harpas, and you think about the idea of the value of citizenship, I think Mexican citizenship is not necessarily the most attractive citizenship, right? And you compare in a global perspective the role of nationality. But I think it will be interesting to see to what extent in the future, and I do think this will be an interesting question, being Mexican changes. And I think part of the answer is found on what does it mean to be Mexican American, right? What does it mean to be a Mexican, from a Mexican origin in the United States? But I also think that it will have to do to what extent, what does it mean to be a binational citizen? And it's interesting that, yes, before you had to renounce, and there's some discussion, for example, if you, I mean, my mom's from Peru, she became Mexican, she had to renounce to Mexican citizen, I mean, Peruvian citizenship, but it's not possible. But if she goes to Peru, she cannot use a Mexican passport. And I think in general, nationality and citizenship has a lot of legal frameworks that even differ between countries. But I think it definitely opens the door to thinking broader. What does it mean to be an immigrant? What does it mean to be a binational citizen? And I think I think we need still better understanding and link between, you were mentioning you're not a sociologist, but between citizenship studies, family studies, migration studies, because this will definitely change the meaning of being Mexican in the long run, and being Mexican American, right? Now, how will a Mexican American define itself if they have a Mexican citizenship and they're living in Mexico, but they go back to the United States for work or for study? This is uncertain. But what is interesting, and something that I really try to point out when I talk to policymakers or the ambassadors, is that this population living in Mexico is currently living under relatively bad conditions, in part because their parents are not reintegrating to Mexican society fully. And so if they grow up in Mexico and then decide to go back to their home country to study or work, they will arrive as a vulnerable population. So inevitably, even if they were born in the United States, living in Mexico with a Mexican citizenship or not, trying to think who is the responsibility of this population to try to secure their well-being for adult life will, I think, define or try to bring together Mexican and US governments, right? This is a population that we share. And the population that we share has been traditionally focused on education, but we need to think about labor market incorporation, about social integration, about how they feel, if they feel Mexican or not, right? And so in the future, the well-being of this population definitely needs to go beyond the idea of being Mexican or being American. And if you think about the population at risk of arriving to Mexico because their parents were returned or were deported, we are not talking about 500,000, right? We're talking about a larger population. So this basic idea that, okay, we need to start thinking about how to talk about this population is still needed. And this, yes, it goes through being, okay, and discussing what it means to be Mexican.
Thank you, Claudia. And we have 2 minutes left. I don't see another hand raised. I do have a question for you, which is about how should we think about this population that's in Mexico? Should we think of them as immigrants? I mean, some of them are US born, right? So, and if so, should we think about Mexico as an immigrant destination? And if that's the case, you know, we know that a lot of theorizing about immigrant adaptation has taken place based on the US experience, which might be actually an outlier when you think about all the different contexts of reception throughout the world. From your point of view, do you think the Mexican experience in dealing with this population, do you think can actually help us to adapt, change, modify in any way our theories that we have developed on immigrant adaptation, on the factors that we know based on the US case play a role in how immigrants fare in their lives? A big focus here in the US is based on the government policies, right? Social prejudice, like illegalities. So those elements seem to be quite different in Mexico, right? So what can the Mexican case tell us about, that could actually help us broaden our theoretical lenses that we use to understand immigrant adaptation?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I'm actually working on that right now. I don't know if I'll be able to give an answer in a minute, but I think, yes, there are definitely lots of things to actually know and learn about this. First of all, I mean, duration of stay, year of arrival, time of residence, it really changes when you think that this population did know about Mexico growing up as Mexicans, right? So these notions about length of stay, I mean, they're very different. Age of arrival will be different. And it's hard, even having citizenship, right? So they might be foreign born, but with a Mexican citizen. Are they natives? No. Are they locals? No. Are they non-migrants? No, they're immigrants, right? And I do think that they question a lot of these categories that we traditionally work with. So this case should definitely inform and change the idea that we have of migrant integration. And I just want to say that this is not exclusive of the Mexican case. So if you think of migration from Venezuela to Colombia, this comprises not only returnees, right, that left Venezuela after the political complications and the crisis, but actually their children, right, who were born in Venezuela and are now in Colombia. So you do have other cases that show that for these children, the traditional frameworks that were thought for adults do not make sense necessarily. Right?
Great, thank you so much for that answer. And I believe we are out of time. I believe but we want to thank you for your wonderful presentation, for sharing your research. I think it's really thought-provoking. It definitely has, I have a lot of questions, and I'll definitely look forward to staying in touch with you. Thank you again for visiting and sharing your work with us, Claudia.
Thank you so much, Rene and Emilio and everyone for the invitation. I see Susan there. Thank you as well for being